I'm 74 years old, and I want to ask you something that nobody has probably asked you in a very long time. Who were you before the world told you who to be? Not who you are now, not the version of you that exists inside your job title, your relationships, your responsibilities, your reputation. Not the you that other people describe when they talk about you. Not the you that shows up consistently and reliably in the role that has been assigned to you, or that you assign to yourself over the years. Who were you before any of that? Before you learned which parts of you were acceptable and which parts needed to be managed? Before you understood which version of yourself got rewarded and which version created friction? Before the world gave you its clear and consistent feedback about who you should be, and you, being human and needing to belong, began to comply. I am asking because I spent most of my life not asking it. And at 74, sitting with the full shape of everything I have lived, I understand that this question, this specific, uncomfortable, surprisingly difficult question, is one of the most important things a person can spend time with. And most people never do. Not because they don't care, but because the question is inconvenient. Because it implies that the answer might be different from the life currently being lived. And different is frightening in a way that staying the same, however quietly dissatisfying staying the same might be, is not. Now, before I go any further, if anything I say today reaches something in you that feels true, please like this video. Share it with someone who you think has lost themselves along the way and who might not know it yet. And subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. These are the conversations I needed at 30, at 40, at 50. Every share means they reach someone who might still have the chance to do something with them. It costs you 2 seconds, and it might give someone else something they have been missing for years. Now, let me tell you what I mean. Here is what I used to believe. I believed that the person I had become was largely the person I had chosen to become. That my identity, the values I held, the ways I moved through the world, the things I cared about and the things I didn't, had been built through conscious choice, through experience and reflection and deliberate self-construction. I believed that the parts of myself I had set aside over the years, the interests I had abandoned, the impulses I had overridden, the capacities I had stopped developing, had been set aside for good reasons, practical reasons, adult reasons, the reasons you accumulate when you have responsibilities and a reputation and a clear sense of what the people around you need from you. I believed that growing up was a process of becoming more yourself, that the self that emerged from decades of living was a truer, more refined, more genuinely you version than the one that had existed before the decades. That time and experience produced clarity about who you actually were. I was wrong about all 3 of those things, and understanding how I was wrong, feeling it, not just thinking it, was one of the most disorienting and ultimately liberating experiences of my adult life. Because here is what I found when I finally looked carefully. The person I had become was not primarily the result of conscious choice. It was primarily the result of adaptation, of 1,000 small adjustments made in response to what the world rewarded and what the world punished, of the gradual, almost imperceptible process of learning which version of me was safe to bring into which room, and then, slowly, bringing only that version, everywhere, until the other versions fell away from disuse, until I forgot they had existed, until the adapted version felt so natural and so permanent that I had stopped being able to see it as adaptation at all. And the parts I had set aside, they were not set aside for good reasons. They were set aside because they were inconvenient, because they didn't fit neatly into the life that was being assembled, because pursuing them would have required a kind of courage, the courage to be something that wasn't immediately legible, wasn't easily explained, wasn't obviously useful, that I hadn't had in sufficient quantity at the moments when it mattered. And the self that emerged from decades of living, it was not more me. In important ways, it was less. It was the me that had survived, not the me that had thrived. Does any part of that land somewhere familiar? The moment I began to understand what had happened arrived in a way I hadn't expected. I was 64. My youngest daughter, she was 28 at the time, was going through a difficult period, and she came to me with something I had not anticipated. She told me that she didn't feel like she knew who she was anymore, that the person she had been in her early 20s, curious, impulsive, creative, not entirely sure where she was going, but genuinely alive in the not knowing, had been gradually replaced by someone more organized, more careful, more appropriate, more useful, and less, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, herself. I sat across from her and I listened. And as I listened, something unexpected happened. I recognized everything she was describing, not as a parent recognizing something general about young adulthood, as a person recognizing his own experience, his specific, personal, 50-year experience of the exact same thing. She was at 28, where I had been at 28, and she still had the awareness of it, the ability to feel the gap between who she was and who she had been. I had felt that gap once too. And then, so gradually I had not noticed it happening, the gap had closed. Not because I had returned to the original, but because I had stopped being able to feel the original at all. The adapted version had become so thoroughly normalized that the question of what was underneath it had simply stopped occurring to me. That conversation with my daughter sent me somewhere I had not been in a very long time, into a kind of internal archaeology, digging through layers of accumulated role and responsibility and reputation, looking for something underneath. And I found things. Not everything. Some of it was genuinely gone, faded past retrieval, but more than I had expected. I found a curiosity I had stopped feeding, an appetite for certain kinds of ideas and questions that had been very alive in me at 25 and had been slowly starved by decades of practical priority. Not destroyed, starved. When I started feeding it again, it came back with a vitality that surprised me. I found preferences I had overridden so consistently that I had stopped registering them as preferences. Things I actually liked and didn't like. about how I spent my time, about the kinds of conversations I wanted to have, about the texture of a good day, that had been subordinated for so long to what was expected or required that I had lost access to them as information about myself. I found a capacity for a certain kind of play, not childish, not irresponsible, but the genuine adult version of following something because it interests you, rather than because it produces something, that I had abandoned decades ago and labeled maturity. And here is what sat with me after all of that. The question that I am still sitting with now, 10 years later, with greater weight each year. How much of what I had called growing up was actually growing, and how much of it was simply narrowing? Because those are not the same thing. Growth and narrowing can look identical from the inside for a very long time. Both involve change. Both involve leaving behind versions of yourself that no longer fit. The difference is the direction. Growth expands your genuine range. Narrowing contracts it. And the narrowing, when it happens through adaptation rather than choice, leaves you with a life that fits the world's requirements, but not necessarily your own. What have you called growing up that might actually have been giving up? And right here, if this is landing, please take 1 second. Hit like. Share this with someone you love who has been slowly disappearing into a role. Subscribe if you haven't already. These words took me 60 years to arrive at. Knowing they reach you while you still have time makes them worth something. Let me tell you what I lost. Not abstractly, in the specific, felt, named reality of a life examined from the inside at 74. I lost my creative life. Not the capacity, that was still there when I went looking, but the decades of it, the years during which that part of me existed at almost zero, because I had decided, or the world had decided for me, and I had accepted, that it was not the productive part, not the serious part, not the part that needed feeding. I was a practical man, a reliable man, a man who produced results, and I was all of those things. But I was also a man who had once been genuinely captivated by making things, by the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of producing something that had not existed before. And I had quietly walked away from that person without a formal goodbye. I lost a relationship with uncertainty. The young version of me had been comfortable not knowing, had been, if anything, energized by open questions, unresolved directions, the feeling of being genuinely in motion without a fixed destination. Somewhere in my 30s, I had traded that for certainty, for the known quantity, for the comfortable predictability of a life where the next 10 years were more or less visible. And the trade had seemed sensible at the time. It had been in many ways sensible. But certainty, accumulated in excess, becomes a different kind of trap. The life that has no room for the unknown has no room for the genuinely new. And I had been living for a long time inside a life with no room for the genuinely new. I lost access to my own emotional life. Not to emotion, I had emotion, but to the full, unmanaged, honest version of it. The young version of me had felt things completely and shown them with less calculation. Over the decades, the calculation had increased. Not dishonestly, not performing emotions I didn't have, but filtering, editing, presenting the version of my emotional life that was legible and appropriate and not too much for the room. And the filtering, sustained over years, had made me someone who could no longer quite access the unfiltered version, even when the room was empty. The habit had become the man. Now let me speak to you directly. Think about who you were at 20, or 22, or whatever age you associate with the version of yourself that felt most genuinely yours before the pressure of the world's expectations really landed. What did that person care about that you no longer make time for? What was that person curious about that you have filed under impractical? What did that person do? Not for any reason, just because it was alive and interesting, that you have not done in years. And here is the harder question. When did you stop? Was there a moment, a decision, a turning point, a specific juncture where you put that part of yourself down and walked away from it? Or did it happen without a moment? In the accumulation of ordinary days, the press of ordinary responsibilities, the slow and entirely reasonable surrender of the self that wanted things to the self that managed things. Most people, when they look honestly, find it was the second. No moment, no decision, just the quiet, gradual replacement of one person by another. So slow that by the time it was complete, they had forgotten what had been there before. You haven't forgotten, not completely. The fact that you're still here, listening to this, means something in you knows what I'm talking about. Something in you recognizes the original. It is still there, quieter than it was, more patient than it should have had to be, but there. What would it take to go back and find it? Here is what I know now, at 74. After my daughter's conversation, and the internal archaeology, and the slow, surprising, genuinely ongoing work of returning to someone I had thought was behind me. You do not lose yourself all at once. That is not how it happens. There is no moment of rupture, no clear before and after, no morning where you wake up and feel the absence of the original. It happens in increments, in the accumulation of small surrenders, in the 1,000 ordinary moments where the adapted version was simply more convenient than the real one, and the real one, finding no outlet, found no reason to persist. And you cannot return to yourself all at once either. That is also not how it works. The archaeology is slow. The excavation is patient work. You do not wake up one morning having recovered everything. You wake up one morning and notice something small, a preference, an interest, an impulse you haven't felt in years. And if you follow it, if you give it even a small amount of attention, rather than filing it immediately under impractical, it leads somewhere. Not immediately, not dramatically, but somewhere. That is how I found my way back, not through a decision, through attention, through the practice of noticing what was still alive in me and choosing, in small, deliberate ways, to feed it rather than starve it. Now, am I telling you to abandon your life, to quit your job, dissolve your responsibilities, return to who you were at 22, as if the decades between then and now had not happened? No, of course not. You are not the same person you were at 22, and you should not try to be. The experience is real. The growth is real. The wisdom that comes from having lived is real and valuable, and not to be discarded. What I am telling you is that somewhere inside the person you have become, inside all of the adaptation and the role and the reputation and the accumulated responsibility, the original is still present. Quieter than it was, more patient than it should have had to be, but present. And that original contains things you need, things the adapted version cannot provide. A relationship with your own genuine preferences, a capacity for curiosity that has nothing to do with usefulness, a comfort with uncertainty that the adapted version traded for the predictable, a quality of aliveness that is not available inside a role, however well the role is played. Here is the warning, given now, at 74, while you still have more time than I did when I first understood this. The version of you that the world has shaped is not the only version available. It is the version that survived, but survival and thriving are not the same thing. And the person you were before the shaping began, before the world gave you its clear and consistent feedback about who was welcome and who was inconvenient, that person had things that the shaped version does not. Not instead of what you have now, in addition to it. The integration of who you were with who you have become is the work of the second half of a life. And it begins with one thing: remembering. Sitting quietly with the question I asked at the beginning: who were you before the world told you who to be? Not to live there again, not to undo the decades, but to remember. To let the original be present rather than buried. To let it inform, even slightly, the choices you make from here. Because the choices you make from here are real. They matter. There is still time to make them as yourself rather than as the adaptation. Not unlimited time. I can tell you that with the authority of someone who is counting the years rather than assuming them. But enough. If you start now. If you ask the question this week rather than filing it under later, go back and find the original. Not to live in the past, to bring something forward from it that has been missing for too long. If this reached something in you, share it with someone who has been slowly disappearing into a role and might not know it yet. With someone who deserves to remember who they were before the world got to them. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment. Tell me who you were before the world changed you. Or tell me something you used to love that you have stopped making time for. I read every single one. Every one. There is more to say. There is always more to say, and at 74, the time to say it is now.